Hello everyone, my name is Lucas Hou and I'm now sitting with Dr. Qingquan Li from UCLA, who studies global relationships focusing on China's strategy in Africa and other continents. Today, we are going to have a conversation about China's investment in Africa and the reaction of Western countries. So, Dr. Qingquan Li, what initially sparked your interest in studying China's influence on Africa?
Well, I was finishing a book on labor protests in China. I've been studying labor in China for a long, long time. And when I finished that book in 2007, at that time, the Western media like BBC, New York Times came out with a lot of reports about labor exploitation by Chinese companies in Africa. That sparked my interest because labor has been my area of interest. And when Chinese companies moved to Africa, I thought that I should follow them as well because of my theoretical interest in Chinese labor issues, labor relations, and how those relations affect the entire economy. And so it's just a natural extension of my past work, even though I have to leave China or Asia and move and follow the money to go to Africa. So that's why I left mainland China as a research target and went to Africa. And I chose to study Zambia because Zambia, among many African countries, is one of the major sites of Chinese investment and also mining investment in copper. I think it's the leading destination of Chinese investment in this industry. And it has been very, very important for China to establish a foothold on the continent because Zambia has a very good relationship with the PRC since the days of Mao. So that's the reason why I chose Zambia as the location for my Africa project.
Thank you. And one of the key themes in your book, The Spectre of Global China, is the idea of Chinese capitalism. How does this form of capitalism differ from Western capitalism, and how does it affect the global economic dynamics?
I think I make a distinction in the book between capital and capitalism. Capital, you can think of it as investment, companies, managers that make the investment happen. But capitalism is a system, is an institutional design for profit making. And I think capitalism is always global. But capital, there are different types of capital. So we can think of industrial capital, land capital, we can think of finance capital. And the way I approach the uniqueness of Chinese investment is not to say Chinese capitalism is different from Western capitalism. What I was trying to say in the book is that Chinese state capital is a different form of capital compared to Western private transnational capital that is privately owned. The very important distinction between the West and China is that in China and from China, you have this form of capital that is tasked with realizing state interest rather than investors' interest. And therefore, when I compare Chinese invested mines, Chinese state invested mines, with Western privately owned mines in the same country, in Zambia, the Chinese mines behave quite differently because it is a kind of investment whose goal is not only making money. It also has to fulfill state-imposed goals like building relationship with the local government, Zambian government. Whereas Western investors, their only goal is to maximize profit for the shareholders. And so the difference between Chinese state capital and Western private capital is in their interest, what they want to realize. And that distinction drives a lot of differences on the ground, how they treat workers, how they build relationship with the government in Zambia, how they think about corporate social responsibility, how long term is their investment. So I think the distinction is not so much between Chinese capitalism with Western capitalism, because there's only one capitalism that is global. But I think there are a lot of differences among the varieties of capital. Chinese state capital, according to my research, behaves very differently from Western private capital that you can become a shareholder of by buying their shares, right? So I hope people make the distinction between capital, of which there are many varieties, but capitalism, there's only one, which is global.
Thank you for answering. I was particularly interested in your discussion of competition between China and Western nations in Africa. What should we know about them? And are there any notable examples that you can share?
There is intense competition between China and the West in two sectors in Africa. One is mining, extractive industry, raw materials, strategic minerals like copper, and also platinum, rare earth, cobalt recently. And the second sector is infrastructure construction. I think for mining, the West has for a long, long time established tremendous influence and power in the mining sector because they were the first colonial rulers. And they went to Africa basically in search of these minerals that are important for the industrialization. And China is now entering the African market, the mining market, following the footsteps of these Western colonizers. And I think China is playing catch up in that game. On the other hand, for infrastructure construction, China is leading in the current period because the West, Western countries, as well as the World Bank, the IMF, they have given up infrastructure in the sense that they don't want to make loans for these countries to build infrastructure. So China came in 20 years ago and tapped into this market that really responded to local needs for infrastructure. The poor roads, if you have been to Africa, you would see just all the major roads, even in the capital cities, have many, many potholes. And so I think there's genuine need among African countries to upgrade their infrastructure. And when the West didn't want to invest in that sector, it opened up a huge market for Chinese state capital to come in. And remember, it is also today is also a period when China has accumulated a lot of excess capacity at home. So all these construction companies, state-owned or privately owned, they're looking for alternative sources of profits. And Africa offers them huge market that is very hungry for that kind of investment from both the public and the private sector. And so in terms of construction, I don't think there is much competition. Everywhere I went in Africa, government's officials told me that there is no competition. The competition is among Chinese companies, not between Chinese companies and Western companies, because the West have lost their interest or appetite for that kind of investment in the continent. And I would add that because China has been so successful in the infrastructure construction market, the United States and other Western countries now are eager to get back into the competition because China has become too influential in their eyes through these infrastructure projects and through these loans for infrastructure. So the G7, you might have heard, the G7 has come up with its own initiative to loan money to African countries to build infrastructure as well. And so the response to China is to have Western sources of loans for African countries to build infrastructure. So that's the result of competition.
Well, I recently spent some time on Chinese social media platform Zhihu. I saw that the topic of is the correlation between China's investment in Africa and its returns proportional sparked a lot of discussion. Some believe that such investment will not benefit China and the government should spend their tax money on improving the living condition of Chinese people instead. So what perspective can you offer on how Chinese populace should access their government's decision and how might Western audience interpret China's investment strategy in Africa?
Right. I'm not surprised that Chinese citizens are critical of the government spending so much money in terms of loans and sending people, sometimes doctors, medical staff, to help or invest in Africa, because Chinese citizens see that there are still so many poor people in the countryside or smaller cities in China. And it's easy for them to see that as a zero-sum game. More for them, that means less for us. But I think the perspective of the government is different. First of all, the government may have longer-term perspective, whereas ordinary citizens would see this reality, the world, in shorter-term horizon, whether I or my family has enough to eat today or in the next few years. But strategies at the government level usually take a longer-term perspective. So building relationship with African countries, goodwill that you cultivate today may bear fruit later on, down the road. And also in places that are not always visible to citizens, like in United Nations when they vote. Would they follow China's vote? They may, these African countries may, if they want to reciprocate Chinese aid or try to show goodwill so that they would receive more aid from Beijing. So all these are interests that are not short-term and they're not reducible to income or economic prosperity today. So I think it's very natural for government to see interests or define interests different from the way ordinary citizens would define national interest. So, and it's not just in China. Many countries reject immigrants under the same mentality, right? That is our resources. Why are we sharing our resources with non-citizens? So it's not a particularly Chinese kind of behavior when citizens want to limit their own taxpayer money or national resources and use them just for their own people and not people outside the territory or people come in as illegal immigrants, In terms of how the West should perceive China's influence in Africa, I think they should also see that China is influential in Africa because China is responding to some genuine needs that African people have. And so it's not like a one-way street, and it's not by coercion that China imposes itself in Africa. That wouldn't work in this day and age. And if China is influential, I think the West should ask the question, why is China more popular there? What do African people and governments see or get from China that the West is not giving? And that's why China and Chinese investment or Chinese people have favorable or are able to get favorable views, public opinion on the ground in Africa rather than Americans or Europeans who are still today perceived as colonizers because of the history of colonialism. So I think there's not enough discussion about the why, about Chinese behavior or Chinese power or Chinese influence. It's not always by coercion or repressive means. There is an element of consent on the part of the local population that Western media has not focused enough. And so the result is this very negative portrayal of China. Whatever China does in Africa is demonized as colonialism or neocolonialism or imperialistic, whereas the local African views are often very, very different.
The Biden administration's U.S.-Africa strategy released in 2022 stated that China regards Africa as an important arena to challenge the rule-based international order, advanced its own narrow commercial and geopolitical interests, undermine transparency and openness, and weaken U.S. relationship with African people and governments. How does this strategy affect global China relationship and its potential effect in the near future?
Well, first of all, it's always difficult to predict the future. And I also like to add that U.S. interest is not homogeneous. Washington may have its own policy, as you stated in the strategy statement, but Wall Street, big corporations, those mining companies they have their own interests in Africa, in engaging with China or in collaborating with China. So it's very difficult to predict, not just because it's in the future, but also because we have multiple powerful players. Each has its own interests when it comes to global China or Africa. So I just want to suggest that whoever wants to figure out those future developments should disaggregate this idea of U.S. interest. There's no one singular U.S. interest, and we always have to pay attention to internal domestic conflicts of interest. There are various influence in policymakers and on the ground. You know, they also compete with each other. They don't always follow one strategy. So yes, it's clear that the Biden administration has reacted to global China's presence in Africa with that strategy that you just told us. But to what degree it gets realized on the ground is subjected to very many forces, and one of which was this kind of internal differentiation and conflicts among U.S. actors themselves. I would say that if I was going to project into the near future, because of the tension between the West and China and global China's presence around the world, we are seeing governments of all kinds trying to de-risk from their exposure from China, in a sense of trying to diversify supply chain so that not everything goes back to China or goes to China or get exported from China. And I think this is the general strategy for all governments, including African governments, now that they have choices, right? If you want loans for infrastructure, you can, of course, go to the Chinese. And because of the G7 initiative, now the West is back into the game. So for many countries, the key word will be diversification and de-risking. You don't want to put all your eggs into one basket, the China basket. And I think this is a safe bet for the near future of how things would move, which is still very much engaging global China, but not as much as in the past. And there'll be more engagement with other parts of the world, which to me seems like a more rational strategy and making the world less volatile.
All right, just as Dr. Li mentioned, it's crucial to underscore that Chinese investment is not a monolistic force sweeping across the globe. Instead, it operates within a nuanced framework, especially evident in Africa, where its impact is far more complex than often portrayed in Western media. By acknowledging this reality, we can foster more insightful discussion and collaboration that lead to mutually beneficial outcome of all parties involved. Thank you.